Well, good morning again to all of you who are joining us, and thank you again for reserving some of your time on this beautiful Tuesday morning to visit with all of us regarding energy codes. I was reminded at the beginning when we were discussing offline the importance of this day in history. On Tuesday, not on Tuesday, but on March 16th, 2015, is that correct? Or 2016, Edith?
2016.
2016, the Greenest Region Compact, Greenest Region Core began. So today is our 5th birthday. So a happy birthday to all those who have helped usher this to our stage we are at today, and to all those who participate and share the passion and the focus and the vision that we all share. So happy birthday to you all. There will be cake afterward, but it will be virtual. So with that, folks, we're discussing today energy codes, a critical tool that help municipalities reduce energy use and greenhouse gas emissions. Today, we're going to learn about the value and benefits of energy codes, how municipalities can become involved in the Illinois code adoption process, and what policies municipalities in the Midwest and nationwide are adopting with respect to their communities. Now, there's something that probably a lot of you are familiar with because you're far more involved than I am, but I learned about the value of energy codes when testifying at the International Code Council, or ICC, public comment hearing in beautiful Las Vegas, Nevada, a little over a year ago. In fact, it was December of 2019, I think it was, right before everything came to a halt. And I had the pleasure of working with some professionals who helped edify me on not only the importance of stretch codes and energy codes in general, but the reality is this, and I want to share this with you, not to impress you, but to impress upon you how unique I thought this was. Apparently, over the course of the last multiple years where the ICC held these public hearings, there has only been one mayor who has ever attended and testified in support of greater stretch codes with respect to energy efficiency. And while I'm certainly honored to have been recognized accordingly, I think the takeaway is that a lot of these building commissioners, professional electricians, professional tradespeople have this assumption that the communities aren't in alignment with the trades and the energy efficiency experts and activists, that moving forward on energy code efficiency is a good thing. When in reality, I think all of us would agree that here on the ground floor, we believe that energy efficiency is critical with respect to energy codes. And it's something that I'm obviously proud of. And the more I talk to my colleagues throughout the Midwest and elsewhere, more and more people are agreeing that a sure and simple way to advance more sustainability is to address at the very grassroots level the energy code efficiency standards. So it's very exciting. And today we have some experts with us today to help kind of walk through all that. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to my friend Edith. And Edith, I believe you have my colleague Cynthia, who's going to provide us some housekeeping issues here. So Cynthia, it's all yours.
Thank you, Mayor Burns. So I just have two housekeeping things to note. First, being that this meeting is going to be recorded and it will be available upon request. And then the second is, since we have such a large group, we can't really do introductions. So if everybody could please rename themselves to reflect their name and then their municipality organization, that would be great. To rename yourselves, you're going to go to the participant tab at the bottom of the screen, in which a panel at the right should show up. You would go to your name, and there's a more option in which rename should be one of those boxes. So if you could just rename yourself to reflect your name and then your organization or municipality, that'd be great. Thank you.
Thank you, Cynthia, very much. And ladies and gentlemen, for those of you who have gotten to know Cynthia as well as we have, and how much we appreciate and value her work, this is her last week with us. She is heading on to new adventures at the Citizens Utility Board, and we are going to miss her dearly, but we certainly congratulate her on her advancement in her career and her continued passion in this space. So thank you, Cynthia.
Thank you.
Ladies and gentlemen, my colleague Edith Macra, whom all of you know. Edith is the Director of Environmental Initiatives at the Metropolitan Mayor's Caucus. Edith?
Great. So thank you all for being here. I'm just going to dive into the topic a little bit. And before we turn it over to the experts, I wanted to lay some groundwork or context for how we got here. Cynthia, if you want to bring up those slides for us, just a little brief history on our journey in getting to know codes and more or less culminating with sending Mayor Burns off to Las Vegas and now our climate action plan as well. Next slide, please. So as Kevin mentioned, the GRC turns 5 today, but the process for developing the Greenest Region Compact, you may know that we studied all the sustainability plans that were published at the time in our region that were by municipalities and relevant for municipalities, and actions that communities were already doing. So this is just the energy policy section of the GRC, and there's actions in there that we put into the GRC, but we could always use some help with. If you see the E+, the plus on this objective there means that it's difficult. So it's just, when we put this together, we said, that's really interesting. Now what? So the next slide, please. And first, in terms of trying to prioritize the energy actions for the GRC, because there's a lot of really important actions, some of them more simple than just the codes, but we wanted to first look at energy planning and looking at, well, help us prioritize what's in the GRC. And some of you have been with the committee for a long time, know that we briefly danced with the National Renewable Energy Lab, or NREL, and asked if they would consider a partnership with us, much like that's called their Cities Leap project. But what they did is they have energy data based on communities, and they can do an analysis and make some recommendations for you. What was really exciting to me was this is just one snapshot from their old platform called Cities Leap from Columbia, Missouri. And if you look at the bar chart on the right of the screen, you'll see building energy codes have the greatest potential of any action that municipality could do. So in reaching their greenhouse gas emissions targets, they were recommending building energy codes. And again, what do we do with them? So next slide up, please. And then we happened onto SoulSmart. I won't say bumbled onto it, but it was a terrific program that we brought the GRC Collaborative to, and made tremendous headway with 30 communities. It's up to, Cheryl, is it 41 that we have certified in Illinois now? 45, excuse me, right on the chart in front of me. More than any other state in the country, and in part because we had the GRC Collaborative and we worked together. And this is when we really, again, learned the power of working on the code side of energy. And then we saw some tremendous advancements for the communities that participated in SoulSmart in rooftop photovoltaic development. Next slide. And then the initiative that Kevin mentioned, and that was getting involved in the supporting the International Energy Conservation Code. Really unaware of that process. It's in the GRC, said we should support it, but we didn't really realize how much of a role that municipalities have in advancing the code. So we did a lot of support. It was like a get out the vote campaign. And we were a part of a national initiative working with the New Buildings Institute and another organization that really helped engage municipalities. So we educated our municipalities. We had our environment committee meeting in ALSIP at IBEW, and then we did a lot of outreach to encourage municipalities to get engaged in various steps throughout the voting process. And then again, Kevin was the first mayor to attend, but really credited for that municipal voice in leveraging really big efficiency gains. So next slide, please. And so there was some good news to that. The Illinois did very well in terms of municipalities voting on the codes. And as a result, Diana and Allison will talk more about this, but the 2021 IECC is the most efficient model code to date, and we're seeing gains of 18% to 14% over the 2018 code, and we're looking at tremendous emissions reductions by 2030, and that's the good news. So we've had this victory, and Allison and Diana may talk about it a little bit more, but I would call a little bit of sore loser problem. So we were so successful in asserting the municipal voice, the ICC decided that that was maybe the voice wasn't, I really want to judge, but they opposed the process by which municipalities got engaged. And some of you were participating. We got an email and sent some messages out right around Christmas time. And again, made kind of a heroic run. Kevin again testified. And we had a lot of comments to say, hey, wait a minute, the municipalities really need a voice, but the ICC made the change anyway. And in the future, we won't have that municipal voice in voting on the process. But again, Allison and Diana will talk a little bit more about that process. So next slide, please. And so all of this, all of you know that we're working on a regional climate action plan, which is coming. I just saw the draft designed copy yesterday and excited about it. So this is just a snapshot from the climate action plan. And one of our 8 mitigation strategies relates to building energy policy. So we know it's really important. This is called a wedge. You'll see lots of them. But this is actually an impressive wedge for all the different actions that we really have control of as local governments. We again realize that this is something that we need to work on. And you'll see the 2 actions that are recommended there generally. But we know that we have a role and we know there's a lot to be done. We have invited Diana and Allison to begin to have a conversation with us as a committee to give us guidance on next actions. We know what we can do. We know what we're good at. And we know it's impactful. So this is really an opening conversation for us. Diana and Allison will talk about opportunities to engage with them. We're exploring what's the next step for the caucus. How can we be helpful? We're really anxious to learn from those municipalities that have already taken some actions, and some of you are already on the call. So we hope this is the beginning of a dialogue on energy codes. So my closing slide there. Is just again. So thank you to all of us who've been with us on the GRC for 5 years as of today, and much more work to do. So I'm happy to turn it back over to Kevin.
Thank you, Edith, very much. Ladies and gentlemen, it's now opportunity to introduce our guest speakers this morning. Allison Lindbergh is the Senior Building Policy Manager at the Midwest Energy Efficiency Alliance, or MEA. Allison is the Senior Building Policy Manager. Her work includes, but not limited to, improving energy efficiency in buildings spanning over 13 states in the Midwest. And this is her, now Allison, is this correct? This is your 2nd week back from maternity leave?
That is correct.
Wow. And Allison,
this is my first presentation back, so bear
fantastic.
with me.
No, gosh, it'll be great. Perhaps we'll even be able to meet the little one. So
maybe.
And our friend Diana Burke is the project manager at the New Buildings Institute. Diana has been involved in energy policy and sustainability work for 14 years as project manager on the codes and policy team at the New Building Institute. Diana helps advance policies to encourage net zero energy and carbon neutral buildings in cities and states across the United States. Allison and Diana, the floor is all yours.
Great. I just want to make sure you can see my screen in the correct mode and everything. Great. Well, thank you so much for having us here. This is a great opportunity, and I always like connecting with the Metropolitan Mayor's Caucus. Thank you, Edith, and thank you, Mayor Burns. So as Mr. Burns mentioned, I'm Allison Lindbergh. I'm with the Midwest Energy Efficiency Alliance. We have over 90 slides of information to share with you today. So we're going to be going through this really quickly, but we'll also be having some polls to just help you get engaged, and we'll have some opportunities for discussion as well. So I'm going to talk a little bit about Mia, and then we'll flip over to my colleague Jeanette, and then also to Diana. So Mia, we're the Midwest Energy Efficiency Alliance. We are a nonprofit organization. We're a membership organization. We represent the Midwest, 13 states. In case you didn't know, the Midwest has 13 states. But basically, we work in my program, we work on policies that are related to energy efficiency in buildings. So I'll just leave it at that. And Jeanette, are you able to unmute yourself and talk a little bit about Slipstream?
Do you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, well, yeah, hi, I'll just take a second. I'm Jeanette Lizax. I am a research director in our research and innovation team at Slipstream. We are also a nonprofit. And I'm working closely with Mia on advancing codes and building related policies in the Chicago area. And I think I just wanted to also mention that we implement a number of different programs, including the new construction program for ComEd, along with a research that I focus on as well. And I really like this opportunity to present this. I am not going to be doing all the talking. I'm letting Allison and Diana do all the talking, but I'll be available for any questions.
Great, thanks, Jeanette. And then I will hand it over to Diana to introduce NBI.
Great. So if you're not familiar with New Buildings Institute or NBI, we are a mission-driven nonprofit based in Portland, Oregon, and we push for better buildings that achieve zero energy and zero carbon through research, policy guidance, and market transformation to protect people and the planet. And that's it.
Great, thank you. So our agenda today, as I mentioned, we have a lot to cover. We're going to talk about the value of building energy policies. Mayor Burns mentioned energy codes, but we're going to be talking about energy codes and policies that go beyond energy codes. We're going to talk about some examples of what some municipalities outside of Illinois have done, and then we'll talk about some of the local updates on what's happening on the policy side and opportunities to get involved. So why are energy policies so important? I think that many of you here probably understand a lot of this already because you wouldn't be on this call if you didn't think that they were somewhat important. But the big one is that buildings make up a big portion of the energy use in our country. Specifically for energy codes, they're the most cost-effective policy that's available. So when we're putting energy codes in place, when we're adopting them, and then when we're achieving full compliance with them, we are doing it for the life of the building because energy codes impact new construction. And just to give you an idea of how impactful they are, this is a 9-year period of building energy code impacts in the Midwest. And you can see in Illinois, which is down towards the bottom of the slide, that's over 4 million tons of CO2 emissions equivalent. So there's a lot of both carbon reduction and greenhouse gas emissions reduction, and then also monetary savings for people just with energy codes. And that translates into other things, thinking about how many wind turbines you would have to install to cover that, how many cars you're removing from the road that cover those savings. So it's a really big impact just with energy codes. But energy codes are just one part of building energy policies. There are above code policies that are also important, and they're important to a lot of different sectors. So for cities specifically, which I'm sure you guys care the most about, they can help you meet climate goals, some of these above code energy policies that we'll be talking about. And because we're improving the buildings themselves, you're improving building stock, you're improving the market value of those buildings, and that's really important for attracting people to your communities. And they help the utilities, and the utilities can also help the communities as well by creating technical assistance programs to help meet their energy efficiency goals. And we'll talk a little bit about that in a bit. For residents, renters, and building owners, there's future energy bill reduction, health benefits, because anything that improves energy efficiency basically improves your overall health with indoor air quality. And as I mentioned, there's the improved building stock. So we're going to be weaving in values of energy codes and values of energy policies throughout this presentation. So I just want you to keep an eye out for that. And the first thing we're going to do is we're going to do a poll about baseline energy codes. So because I'm going to talk about energy codes, and I want to know how many of you have already been involved in this process. So Mayor Burns talked about the 2021 IECC process. So if you don't mind going down to the polls and answering this and answering whether you had been part of that voting process. And we'll just give it a few more seconds here. Isn't this amazing? I love that we're able to do this. It makes these meetings so much more enjoyable, knowing that you can participate a little bit. Okay, so we have 70% voted. I'll just give it 5 more seconds. Okay, so I see that about 80% of you did not participate, and that's great. What I do see is 20% of you did, which is huge. In the past, this was not a thing that actually really happened, which is one of the reasons why the IECC really was struggling with whether they wanted to keep that process that way. And we'll talk a little bit more about that going forward. But so that being said, I'm going to make sure and touch on some of these things about energy codes so that you all understand what energy codes are. We're not going to spend a lot of time on this because we're going to move on to the other energy policies. So basically, what are energy codes? In the shortest, simplest terms, an energy code is a policy that is the worst building that can be built. So think of it as the bare minimum. It's the floor. And energy codes are good because they get developed and improved every 3 years. And so you're basically raising the floor as you keep adopting the energy codes. And I'll talk a little bit more about how Illinois does their code work later on. But basically, there's 2 things. There's the adoption of the energy code, and then there's the enforcement and compliance. And both are really important pieces for municipalities to consider, making sure that you do full adoption and compliance with the code, because a policy is only as good as the compliance that goes with it. So what do energy codes actually cover? Well, they cover everything that's in the building, basically, for residential and commercial. So it's new construction, newly constructed buildings, and then major renovations and repairs. But essentially, windows, walls, ceilings, floors. So you think insulation, programmable thermostats are in there, energy efficient mechanical systems, anything that has to do with the energy of the building. So Diana's going to talk a little bit more about some of the advanced things that are coming into code so that you can see how things are changing. But historically, this is what an energy code covers. And so for residential, they cover 3 stories or less. For commercial, they cover all non-residential buildings and then multifamily buildings that are over 3 stories. So both codes apply to new construction, and then, as I mentioned, for existing buildings, additions, major renovations. And as I also mentioned, the codes are getting more energy efficient every year. And that's part of all of you participating in that process, the development process. So this is residential for the International Energy Conservation Code, and this is commercial for ASHRAE, which is an option for the commercial IECC. And this is very technical stuff. Don't worry, you don't have to remember it. If you really want to get into it, you can just ask one of us that's on the call someday. But you'll see that over time, the increases have gotten smaller and smaller. And so that's why we're talking today about some of the above code policies that you can implement. And just to give you a little bit of flavor on what's happening in the Midwest in terms of adoption, you can see that Illinois is one of the leaders as a state. So for residential, they have the 2018 IUCC, soon to be the 2021. That's because the state has an automatic adoption process that happens every 3 years when the code gets updated nationally. But most states don't have that. So most states just kind of have to do it on a different cycle. And so that's why they're a little bit further behind. And this is for the commercial code. So non-compliance, I just want to touch on this as, again, a policy is only as good as the compliance that comes with it. And non-compliance, you'd think code is code, right? Like people have to comply with the code. Why don't people comply with the code? Isn't it law? Well, energy codes are seen a little bit differently in the industry. And it's not that people necessarily are trying to not comply, but there's a couple of different barriers that municipalities can actually help with to achieve additional compliance. Just basically helping to increase technical assistance because there's a lack of awareness and understanding and how to meet the requirements. And there's just a lack of consistent training and funding for compliance improvement. So this is one thing that the utilities have been exploring is, can they help provide technical assistance to help achieve and increase compliance in municipalities. And there are other ways that municipalities can get involved in increasing energy code compliance. I'm happy to talk about that with anyone if you're interested. So right now we're going to move on to beyond energy codes. So we consider just regular energy codes, baseline energy codes. The next thing I'm going to talk about is stretch codes. Stretch codes are one of my favorite things in the entire world. I think that there's an interesting and amazing opportunity for municipalities to affect new construction in a very good way that the industry understands, because you're basically creating another code, and it's just like a code except for that it's above the floor of the code that I talked about before. So instead of it being just the worst code, it's, I guess you would call the second worst code, because it's like the new baseline. So it's also known as a reach code. It's called a stretch because sometimes it eventually becomes the baseline code. And so it gives like a little bit more time, and it stretches out that amount of time for people to get used to that particular code before it becomes the baseline code again. And I'll go into a little bit more details about this, but why would you consider something like this? Well, as you saw, the incremental increases in the national code were being very small. Like they're increasing less quickly than some of us would hope. So it's an opportunity for municipalities to really help to meet their climate goals. And because it's energy codes, but more, it's a cost savings for residents and businesses. And then the nice thing is it helps to create market acceptance so that it can become like the statewide code later. So that's what I'm going to say about stretch codes. We're going to talk more about this when Diana goes into some of the opportunities that we have for stretch codes in Illinois, and I'll also be talking about some of the opportunities for Illinois. I'm going to move on to benchmarking ordinances just so that we keep things going. So basically benchmarking, I'm sure a lot of you already here know what it is, but just in case you don't, it's basically if you have climate goals or energy efficiency goals, you don't know if you've met them if you're not measuring them. And so the way that you do that is through energy benchmarking. And basically to benchmark, you need two different things. You need the general building characteristics, and you need the utility consumption information. Usually you put this information into some kind of software like Energy Star Portfolio Manager, and that helps to establish a baseline of energy use for that building. Now, benchmarking covers existing buildings, whereas codes and stretch codes were new construction. This is existing buildings. And then once you have that baseline, you can either compare the building to itself over time, or you can compare it to other buildings. And just looking at your benchmarking information and looking at those utility bills over time, you tend to make really incremental improvements to improve that building's performance. It's been shown that about an average of 2.4% per year is that energy consumption change. It's just like when you start counting your steps, you automatically start increasing your steps just because you're more aware of it. The same thing happens when you benchmark. And so it also helps with the Energy Star score over time, just in that same idea of just monitoring it over time. So you don't even have to make any big improvements. Just looking at your data may help you increase the efficiency of your building. So consistent benchmarking results in energy savings and improved performance, but it also can help provide information if you need to have bigger investments or make bigger changes to make your building perform better. And also, when you put a score on a building, that helps with the market transformation, because it basically shows the market which buildings are performing better and which buildings have more opportunities for improving their energy efficiency. So putting a benchmarking policy in place is one way to ensure that your community can actually help to meet those goals and that you can measure those goals. These are some examples of ordinances that are across the Midwest. This is not all of them. There are different flavors of ordinances, and a lot of these cities are also benchmarking their own city-owned buildings, which is not demonstrated here. And I'm sure a lot of you are doing that as well. So the next step after a benchmarking ordinance is to put in place a building performance standard. So while a benchmarking policy is looking at tracking the energy efficiency of those buildings, it doesn't require any kind of improvements. It just says, we want to see how your buildings are doing because we want to help you identify opportunities. And a building performance standard actually sets goals and targets to require you to meet certain goals. And so that might include efficiency improvements. It might include energy management strategies. So I'll talk a little bit about building performance standards, and Diana is going to cover some of this as well. But basically, as I said, it's just an ordinance that helps to move buildings forward in terms of their performance. And for those of you that are concerned about jobs, because we all are, this is the a policy that really helps with job creation, because you're actually requiring new energy management or new improvements to buildings. So basically, a building performance standard sets an energy use or carbon emission threshold for commercial buildings within that jurisdiction. And then the property managers report it, and then they're required to meet certain goals. And they can either make operational or mechanical systems improvements or capital improvements. And again, Diana's going to go into like some things that you should consider when doing a building performance standard, but they usually are differentiated by size or building type. And then the standards themselves typically target the worst performing buildings first, and then over time it changes. And you'll see here, so these are rather newer ideas for in terms of energy policies. And St. Louis is one of the cities that has enacted this, and I'll talk a little bit more about that later. But these are some of the different flavors of building policies. So really, it's not a one size fits all type of policy. It's something that as a jurisdiction, you need to determine what works best for you with the building types that you have, with the needs and climate goals that you have. But you'll see that the first one was passed in 2018, and it is not going to be enforced until 2026. So typically, these building performance standards have a longer time frame before people are required to actually make those improvements. You'll even see that St. Louis has 5 years. So now I'm going to turn it over to Diana, and she's going to talk about some really above code policies. And Diana, take it away. Let me know when to advance.
Great. Thanks so much, Allison. So as we think about how to develop effective building policies like energy codes, stretch codes, and building performance standards, we have to have a clear goal in mind. For us at New Buildings Institute, our goal is to develop policies that reduce our impact on climate change, policies that will get us to a zero carbon future. Next slide, please. Thanks. NBI centers our building policy work on what we call the 5 foundations, which together get us to a zero carbon building future. These foundations are in a specific loading order, with energy efficiency starting first, the most cost-effective strategy. Next slide, please. Before we go further, let's go through some definitions so we can all be on the same page as we discuss these policies. Next slide, please. So I'm sure many of you have heard of a zero energy or net zero energy building. Next slide. A zero energy building, as defined by the Department of Energy, is a building that combines energy efficiency and renewable energy to consume only as much energy as can be produced on site. Currently, the 2021 ICC has a zero net energy building appendix. So this is what the appendix would require if a jurisdiction adopted it as a stretch code. Next slide, please. NBI advocates for policies that create a zero operational carbon building in codes at both the state and local level. About 2 weeks ago, ASHRAE, who develops our base commercial energy code, just created a task force for building decarbonization, and we hope they will also begin to focus on this work. Next slide, please. So what is a zero operational carbon building? A zero operational carbon building is defined as one that is highly energy efficient and produces or procures on-site carbon-free renewable energy in an amount sufficient to offset the annual carbon emissions associated with operations. Next slide, please. Electrification, another foundation, refers to replacing one's combustion equipment with equipment that uses electricity. The most cost-effective way to get to a zero operational carbon building is to electrify. Purchasing or installing renewable electricity to run a heat pump in your building, which runs on electricity, is a lot more cost-effective than purchasing carbon offsets to offset the natural gas consumption of one's furnace or boiler. So after energy efficiency and renewable energy, the next step to a zero operational carbon building is electrification. Next slide, please. But if a lot of buildings move to electrification, we have to start considering how the building and grid interact, and we have to better integrate them. Building grid integration refers to the integration and optimization of our buildings with the nation's energy grid. Next slide. After considering how to make our buildings operate using no carbon, the last step to a zero carbon building policy would include embodied carbon. Next slide. Building materials and construction account for 11% of global energy-related carbon emissions. As buildings increasingly target high efficiency levels and low or zero carbon operations, the embodied carbon in the materials used to construct buildings constitute a growing share of buildings' carbon impact over its lifetime. Next slide. So let's talk a little bit more about carbon emissions as it relates to Illinois. Next slide. So back to these. Why is grid integration and storage so important to this zero operational carbon policy? Next slide. Illinois' electricity grid sometimes acts like it did on October 24, 2017, where the electricity consumed was relatively steady throughout the day. That's the blue line at the top, as was renewable generation, which is the yellow line in the middle. Renewables in the Midwest are generated mostly from wind, and typically the wind blows steadily throughout the day. Next slide. However, on a not so windy spring day in the Midwest, wind generation can be less reliable. The blue line shows electricity demand, again, relatively steady throughout the day, but the orange line shows wind generation, which is not so steady. The gray line shows the net load on other power plants. As you can see, on this spring day in the evening around midnight, Illinois had to turn on their peaking natural gas plants, as shown by the gray line, around midnight to meet electricity demand because the normally reliable wind power could not meet that demand. With around 10% of Illinois' energy coming from wind, this is not a huge problem. But as Illinois tries to meet its climate goals and increases the amount of renewables in its electricity grid, it could become one. Next slide. So what do we do? Oh, go back one. Thanks. We can no longer think of the grid as being one way with a conventional power plant delivering steady electricity to our homes and offices. Next slide. We really have to think of our building and grid acting both ways, where distributed energy resources from our electric cars and buildings interact with the grid to store those intermittent sources of energy from wind and solar when they are oversupplying, so that we don't have to worry about turning on our fossil fuel plants when the wind isn't blowing or the sun isn't shining. Next slide. How can buildings help the grid as we transition to this cleaner electricity supply? Well, first we have to do a lot more efficiency, and the 2021 ICC gets you there. But then we have to figure out how to shift a building's energy use off those times when there's a lot of electricity demand at the same time. We also have to start installing some sort of dynamic response to the grid so that buildings can reduce its energy use actively due to short-term grid constraints by, for example, installing a demand response on your hot water heater or thermostat. Finally, we have to think how we can store that energy by using the batteries in our electric vehicles to store the electricity based on grid signals. Next slide. Now let's talk about electrification. Next slide. I also, currently electrification is making a lot of headlines. Click this slide. Cities are banning natural gas in new homes to reduce impacts on climate change. And in some states, there is currently backlash to this ban, and legislation is being introduced to ban the ban so that cities cannot require electrification. Next slide. Why is electrification so important? Well, if you do it right, it saves consumers money over the long run. Heat pump water heaters and air source heat pumps to heat and cool buildings are very efficient technologies and work well in the Midwest. Electrification also enables better grid management. It reduces carbon emissions because you're no longer burning natural gas to heat your homes, and it improves the indoor air quality and safety of our buildings. Next slide. So again, those are the 5 foundations of zero carbon building policies. I will talk more later about how municipalities can push for building policies that incorporate these 5 principles. Now, Allison, it's back to you.
Great. And it's time for a poll. So if you'll pull up poll number 2, please. And so basically select all that apply. Has your municipality begun discussing any of these beyond code policies? And we'll just give a little bit of time so that you can think this through. GEB is grid interactive efficient buildings. Oh, okay. I guess we have a different slide here. Sorry, guys. Good. And keep filling this out. I also just want to recommend, if you have any questions following up this primer that we gave you on building policies, please put them into the chat and we'd be happy to answer them. All right, just a couple more seconds. Okay, so renewable energy looks like it has rose to the forefront here, which is very interesting. Benchmarking and building performance standards have been considered. Don't see any embodied carbon, stretch codes 13%. This is very interesting. Thank you for this information. I just want to make sure we're going to go into the kind of next section. We weren't planning on having discussion after this. We were just going to answer some questions if possible or if necessary, but I wanted to give people a chance. Edith or Mayor Burns, do you have anything that you'd like to add or any questions that you think have popped up? I don't see anything personally in the chat, but I want to make sure I'm not missing any.
Yeah, I was going to ask you the same thing. Cheryl, anything particular that sticks out in the chat that's worth either Allison or Diana, which of course everything is worth them addressing, but anything in particular that?
So I just put into the chat, if anybody, we had such accomplishments in solar. I'm assuming
Right.
most of them are related to SolSmart, but if you've done something differently, you can put that in the chat. I would like to, if there's time, talk more about benchmarking. So I've had some thoughts about benchmarking for communities that are mostly suburban. And so if there's anything that you can talk to about, Mayor Burns, more, if you want to help me with that question, is the benchmarking ordinances have worked for larger cities with larger building stock. But what do you do for a threshold when you might not have a lot of large buildings? And is there anything? I saw some voluntary ones. So that's the question that I would put out there.
Sure. Sorry, Mayor Burns.
If I may, I want to leapfrog onto Edith's question. If a community does not have a lot of large buildings per se, is it worth benchmarking just the municipally owned buildings to get a flavor for what can be accomplished? Or is that not worth the effort, in your opinion?
Sure. So I would say it's always worth for a municipality to benchmark their own buildings because you might find some opportunities there to reduce energy consumption, and that's good for the residents. That's good for the people within the community to know that as a city, you're being fiscally responsible and you're looking at the energy efficiency of your buildings. I do have a few slides coming up that will talk about some other cities that have done things that aren't exactly benchmarking, and that there is a way for suburban cities to actually get involved with like benchmarking like policies. So I will hit on that coming up, Edith, if that's okay for you, if I address that there.
I
Okay,
have a
great.
quick follow-up as well.
Mm-hmm.
And this is from some of my colleagues, or the electeds, as I call them. Benchmarking is great because it's a snapshot in time. Does benchmarking then force the hand of policymakers to do more? Because what's the point of benchmarking if you're not going to improve? Therefore, the fear of benchmarking is to identify our shortcomings.
Sure. And I would say that is a fantastic question and legitimate if you're a building owner to have those concerns. I know we have lots of other people on this call that can probably answer that, but I'll just take it since I'm the speaker, I guess, today, one of the speakers today. But I would say that with working with utility programs can be one of the ways that you can help to offset any of those concerns, knowing that if there are opportunities for improvement that are identified, that utilities often offer technical assistance to help defer those costs. And then for, the next step would be a building performance standard if you're going to go that path, but maybe you're not. Maybe you're just going to benchmark and you're just going to work with utilities to help improve those buildings that maybe want that help. So it doesn't have to be a yes, we're going to do that. We're going to take that next step. But I do feel like once building owners actually start benchmarking and start seeing how their buildings compare, that they actually get kind of excited about what they can do to improve their buildings. And so that's why we recommend that stepped approach so that you can just get a flavor for it and an understanding of what it actually means. Because once you actually start doing it, it's not as scary as it sounds. And that's why, New York City, how many buildings do they have? They're doing this. They passed it. So I feel like with those big cities and all of those commercial building owners out there, if they were able to sway them to do it, then, there might be something into it. Maybe they're really seeing some benefits from doing it. Now, I know we're not talking about New York City with all of the cities here, and they have a different set of problems, but I feel like if they can tackle that in their commercial building industry there, then hopefully that can translate to somewhere like here. Okay, so I did see a good question about variances from the standard code. It would be very helpful with other municipalities are interested in stretch codes or other ways to increase energy efficiency if we could do something regionally. That was from Kim Stone from Highland Park. Kim, we'll be talking a little bit about that actually coming up. So thank you for that. I agree that variances in code can be frustrating just in terms of wanting to have something that's consistent across jurisdictions. Great. Thank you for sharing, Village of Oswego. I'm going to move on so that we can keep going through all of these slides, but we're going to have an opportunity for more discussion coming up. So moving on to the next. So we're going to talk about some municipal initiatives. So I want to first talk about stretch codes, and I'm just going to mention one example. And there are lots of examples of stretch codes, and there's lots of different flavors of stretch codes. But I think that Massachusetts has a good comparison to something that could be happening in Illinois. So Massachusetts was the first state to adopt what we would consider like a typical stretch code these days. So they have a statewide energy code, but they created an appendix chapter that had, it was an optional appendix, and it could be adopted by local municipalities. And then once it was adopted by the local municipalities, then basically that became the stretch code or the baseline code for that municipality. And so in a sense, that means you have two codes. So to Highland Park, who asked about wanting consistency, this is one of the ways that you do that, is that you create a code that is the same for the entire state, and then local jurisdictions adopt just that stretch code. So you either have the base code or you have the stretch code, and then you don't have the variances across the different jurisdictions. And just to show you the success of this, so Massachusetts combined this with both some affordable housing programs and with utility technical programs. And so that's why they've been able to get so much participation with their stretch code. And this is an old slide. There's more participation than there is now. And I just also want to go back to this previous slide. They've updated their stretch code over time. And so aspects of the stretch code actually went into play and then became parts of their new base code. So like, as I mentioned before, the stretch code provides that stretch and kind of helps the market get used to some of the new ideas that are in the base code or in the stretch code. And then I'll just talk about some building performance standards too. So St. Louis is the only city in the Midwest that has passed a building performance standard. So Mayor Burns, to your question, you know, St. Louis doesn't have a ton of huge buildings either. Like they have some, but not a lot. So they worked locally to figure out what was best for their jurisdiction, and they measured their building energy use in intensity. They aligned it with their climate goals, and I only show this not as a best practice, but just as an example. I think that it's really important that if any city or village is considering a building performance standard or any policy, that you really work with what works for you locally. And what we're seeing for building performance standards is that they vary widely across the United States. And Diana's going to talk more about that and what you should be considering. And then to get to what Edith had mentioned, so for some different ideas, so if maybe you don't want to pass a benchmarking standard, a benchmarking ordinance, maybe it doesn't make sense because you don't have a lot of commercial privately owned buildings, or maybe it does, but it looks a little bit different. So these are some examples of some policies that have happened in Minnesota. And what I like about this is that some of these initiatives happened first, and then they passed benchmarking ordinances. So St. Paul, Minnesota, so in St. Paul, they can't pass a stretch code. In all cities in Minnesota, right now, they can't pass a stretch code because they have what's called a min-max code, which means that the energy code is the minimum and the maximum that a jurisdiction can adopt. And so instead, they have to become more creative with the different types of things that they can pass. And so in order to meet their goals there, they one of the things that they did was anything that was receiving financial assistance from the city of St. Paul then had to achieve a certain kind of energy certification, like LEED or Passive House. There's a number of them, and it also has to benchmark energy consumption. So that was one way that they did it without actually passing a code or a stretch code, and also helps with their existing buildings. Now St. Paul has a benchmarking ordinance. So that this was something that they did first to get people used to the idea of benchmarking their buildings, and now they have the benchmarking ordinance. St. Louis Park has put in place a planned unit development policy. So I'm sure, or maybe not, planned unit development is essentially when you have a new construction project and you go to the city and you want to get approval for it. Usually that's called a planned unit development, and it needs like a certain approval process. So any planned unit development that came through the city of St. Louis Park was required to meet Sustainable Buildings 2030, which is basically Minnesota's version of Architecture 2030. If you're familiar with that standard, that basically gets you to net zero by 2030. And that includes annual energy benchmarking. So they passed this for all planned planned unit developments, which basically affected all new commercial construction, but isn't a stretch code. It's not technically a code, but it affects all new construction. And so this was one way that they were able to do this with having those hindrances of a stretch code. Because they got people used to the annual benchmarking with this code, then they were able to pass a benchmarking ordinance. So now they have a benchmarking ordinance. Hennepin County, Minnesota, which is the county in Minnesota that has that encompasses Minneapolis. Minneapolis passed a benchmarking ordinance, and then Hennepin County saw that there were a lot of suburban cities in the Minneapolis suburbs that also wanted to do benchmarking but weren't sure how to do it. So they actually created a technical assistance kind of handbook that works to help those cities identify which aspects of a benchmarking policy they might want to pass, and helps them tailor it to their specific needs. And so that's a really interesting thing to look at. And I would highly suggest that the Metropolitan Mayor's Caucus look at that. I will also say that Jeanette's going to talk a little bit about some of the energy planning that we're working on with ComEd, and that could fall into that work as well. And then just as another thing, Minneapolis passed what's called a truth in housing point of sale policy. You all in Illinois already have like point of sale. And I don't know if you are utilizing that though. So in case you didn't know, you're required for I'm sorry, I'm having my mom brain. For any building that is being sold, that's a single family home, that you energy use has to be provided. And that is actually a really great way to transform the market. And I don't hear as many people talk about it as I think people could. I think it's a really great thing. So that's something to look into and get involved with your realtors on. So that being said, those are some examples of some policies. And now Diana is going to go through some things to consider when looking at these standards and different types of policies. So Diana, I'll pass it on to you.
Great, thanks, Allison. So I'm going to be talking about sort of some guidance on building performance standards. As Allison mentioned, there are not that many in the United States. There are currently 4 building performance standards, or sometimes you call them BPS standards, that have been adopted in the United States. New York City has adopted one, Washington, D.C., St. Louis, and Washington State, all identified with the yellow stars on this map. Through the American Cities Climate Challenge, which is a challenge funded by Michael Bloomberg's foundation, New Buildings Institute has been part of a group of guiding an additional cohort of cities who are in the process of establishing a building performance standard. Los Angeles, Denver, and Boston have all already publicly announced that they will be establishing BPS for their city, as well as Cambridge. And then 10 to 12 additional cities are exploring creating that standard. Next slide, please. So to help guide that cohort of cities in the American Cities Climate Challenge, NDI has worked with other organizations to establish a framework on establishing a BPS, since they're still a relatively new policy. The framework is broken out into 3 steps. The first step is preparation. Establishing a BPS is much more complicated than establishing a new building energy code or a stretch code, because one is dealing with a diverse set of existing buildings and a diverse set of stakeholders who will be affected by the policy, and those buildings don't exist in other cities. So preparation is really key. You need to do clear goal setting, market segmentation analysis to figure out what buildings you have, and then have a robust stakeholder engagement process. The second step to establishing a BPS is the policy-making stage, because the building stock of each city is different, and because the policy goals of each city could differ, each BPS also is different. The BPSs in the 4 cities that have adopted are all different. So each city must decide the nuts and bolts of policy design. For example, what metric will they use to measure building performance? What threshold should existing buildings meet when they're trying to improve their efficiency? And what compliance pathways should be allowed? Cities also have to consider how they will establish a funding mechanism and increase staffing so they can implement the building performance standards successfully. Smaller cities like those in the Metropolitan Mayor's Caucus, for example, who couldn't fund a full-time staff to implement a BPS by themselves, you may want to collaborate across cities to create a body to implement a BPS across multiple jurisdictions. Finally, a communications and political strategy should also be considered at this stage so the legislation actually gets passed. The third step is implementation. In this step, the city must re-engage with stakeholders to make sure that the policy is implemented effectively and establish tools and resources to support building owners and workers who must do the necessary work so that buildings meet these new standards. Next slide. So I don't have time to go into all 3 steps into detail here, but I do want to hit on a few major highlights in the framework. The first step is preparation, and I think this is the most crucial step in establishing a BPS. Some cities have spent upwards of a year or more developing a BPS policy that works for their city. As with most things in life, the more you prepare, the fewer hiccups and challenges you will encounter later. Perhaps the most important component of preparation is laying out clear goals for a building performance standard. What does a successful BPS look like for your city? We recommend that cities develop a clear set of twin goals around both equity and climate. A building performance standard is often one of the most effective policies a city can enact to tackle climate change because of the number of buildings policy can touch every year. At the same time, we want to make sure that meeting any goal in a BPS does not unfairly burden low-income communities, for example, by requiring expensive upgrades in a community that has limited access to capital. Ideally, a BPS would benefit low-income communities by reducing their energy burden and allowing them to take part in the job opportunities created by the policy. Finally, establishing a robust stakeholder and community engagement process is key to establishing a successful building performance standard policy for several reasons. First, by getting input from stakeholders, one can gain key critical perspectives. You will foster transparency in the process, which helps create trust in the development. You will also build support for your policy, which will eventually smooth its way to being passed in your city. If you engage stakeholders, key stakeholders, your policy is also more likely to be designed well, addressing your twin goals of equity and climate. And finally, a stakeholder process could result in the creation of key partnerships that might be crucial for implementation. Next slide, please.
No, I mean, I think
Step 2 of policymaking is establishing the nuts and bolts of a BPS. There are 7 main categories that a city must address in a BPS. I'll go over 2 of these in more detail in the next few slides. Next slide, please. One of the more critical decisions for a city is deciding what metric to use. Should one require a building to reduce its carbon emissions per square foot, like New York City? Or should one require city buildings to be more energy efficient by requiring a certain Energy Star score, like DC, or by meeting a certain site energy use intensity threshold, like St. Louis? Each of these metrics have their own benefits and drawbacks, and choosing the correct one depends on the policy goals of a city. Next slide, please. Once a city decides on a metric, they must also decide on the compliance pathway. Should the compliance pathway be absolute, such that buildings must meet a clearly defined threshold by going below a certain required, for example, energy use intensity by a certain date? Or should cities allow buildings to improve by a certain percentage over time, like in Washington, DC? A third compliance pathway could be prescriptive. Should a policy allow buildings to get an energy audit or complete a list of required upgrades to the building to meet the requirements in a building performance standard? Next slide, please. So the final step in a BPS is implementation. Again, I don't have time to go into each of the implementation steps, but I did want to say that increased city staffing to support the implementation of a BPS is crucial. Washington, DC, whose BPS ordinance covers 2,000 buildings, but will grow to 5,500 buildings over time, allocated $1 million per year to pay 7 full-time staff and other costs like travel, training, contracts, and consulting fees. The city also supported the establishment of a building innovation hub, which is a resource hub housing 2 external staff to provide technical assistance to helping buildings meet that standard. Of course, with smaller towns and fewer buildings, you don't need that many resources, but you do need to consider the resources you need. And again, if multiple towns in the Metropolitan Mayor's Caucus were interested in establishing a BPS, they might want to work together to share those resources across jurisdictions. All right, I'm done. I'll pass it back to Allison.
Great. Thanks so much, Diana. I am going to be cognizant of time. I think we're going to shorten some things up that we have in the end. But first, I want to go to another poll. So are there any cities that you mentioned today that are most similar to your municipality's energy policies, interested needs, or anything else? So this is just open-ended. Please put this into the chat. And then let's see. I just want to make sure I have these polls correct. Let's go to poll 4. Would you want to work with or receive support from any Illinois utilities or any of these policies? Great. Well, so far it's looking pretty positive, and in the sense of people are answering positively with a yes. Great. Okay, well, good. I guess it's a resounding yes. I mean, who doesn't want help, right?
I was gonna say, if there's a no in there, also, we need to know who it is.
Well, great. So I'm gonna, I guess, Edith, I want to make sure that this works best for you. But what I'm thinking is I'm going to move on to what's happening in Illinois and some updates, and then we can open that up for discussion. Does that work with you? I just want to be cognizant of time because we have until 11:30. Is that correct?
Correct.
That works perfectly also. Thank you.
Okay. Well, great. So we're going to just update you briefly on what's happening in Illinois, some opportunities to move forward. Diana, I just want to let you know that I might cut some of the stuff short that you have, just because I think that it's going to take up a lot of time, and I want to really get to the conversation with the mayors, if that's okay. Okay, sorry about that. So as you guys heard, the IECC, you guys, some of you participated, about 20% of you did. And now the IECC is going to a standards process. And what that means is that municipalities will now no longer have an official vote on these code changes. That's because you guys made a huge impact, and you should be very proud of that. What this means, though, we are still not entirely sure, because we don't know what this process is going to look like. They're developing it. But I do think that municipalities will still be able to be involved in the process. And so if you are interested, Mia will be kind of helping on that. I'm sure NBI will be helping on that as well. So one thing I will just suggest is that Mia, we have a newsletter. I'm sure that New Buildings Institute also has a newsletter that talks about some of the policy updates that happen in the region. And you can sign up to get that in your email, and then you can hear how to get involved. We also will work with Edith on keeping you guys updated on what's happening with this process. But I do think that there will be feedback that municipalities can provide, but you guys won't have official representation, which is very different, but just wanted to let you know that that's how that is. So going forward with Illinois specifically, this is about to adopt the new version of the energy code, because through statute they have to update it to the most recent version of the IECC. So they're going to begin doing that process in a few months. It typically takes about 18 months for the process to be final, but they actually have to, that's from when the code is, I don't know. Anyway, that's the typical time frame. It's supposed to be within a year, but it usually takes about 18 months. So we'll see what happens. Again, that's a place where you can get involved if you're interested. as I was mentioning that stretch codes certain states have different laws. The way that Illinois works is that municipalities over 1 million in population can adopt a residential code and a commercial code if they want to on the energy side that is more stringent than the state-based code. The other municipalities that are below 1 million, you can adopt an energy code for commercial buildings that's higher than the state code, but not for residential. So you could adopt a stretch code for commercial buildings. And the other part is that no matter what people say, the energy code for the state must be adopted and enforced in your jurisdiction. So other codes are different. Other codes, you can change it, but for the energy code and the plumbing code, those two codes in Illinois specifically, you must adopt and enforce the state code. So just so you know that, I know there's been some confusion over that. And for local, for code officials and for enforcement, it's the local officials that enforce the code. In other states, it's state officials. So that's just the way that Illinois works. This is the process for the Illinois code adoption. So just like you did for the IECC, if you got involved, you can also get involved in this process, and you can help to bring amendments forward. So as Diana had mentioned, maybe some of you heard earlier that NBI in the state of Minnesota was able to propose some amendments to their new commercial code. I see there's a question about EV ready. Yes, that's something that you could propose as the state code. So if you wanted to get involved in this process, you could put forth an amendment. You could say, hey, we want this to become part of the state code. And then that would become mandatory for all jurisdictions in the state of Illinois. Whereas if that didn't happen with the state code process, you yourself as a jurisdiction, you could, for commercial buildings, make EV ready part of it, but not for residential unless you're the city of Chicago. So I hope that that makes sense. We can go over that if it doesn't. But this is the code adoption process. You don't really need to know this right now. You just need to know that they haven't really started it yet. And if you're interested in getting involved, you can talk with Edith, who will be working with Mia and Slipstream on this going forward. So just another little Illinois update in case you weren't aware that Governor Pritzker signed an executive order in January of 2019, entering Illinois to the U.S. Climate Alliance. And so we do have goals here, Governor Pritzker's goals to reduce greenhouse gas emissions by 2025. And as part of that, there is some legislation right now for the state of Illinois that is working through the Clean Jobs Coalition and the governor's energy plan that would require the state to develop a stretch code and a BPS. And so what this would mean is that the state would develop this optional stretch code, jurisdictions could adopt it, and then it would be residential as well, which would mean that you could also adopt a residential stretch code, which you currently can't do. And then the building performance standard would basically be many different options available, but more kind of that Hennepin County idea that I said, where there would be different options for different like sizes of jurisdictions and buildings and things like that, but would give municipalities a way to work through this process. So this is a piece of legislation that is currently going through the process right now. It's in the Clean Energy Jobs Act. There is also a separate bill that has just these two entities in it as well. So just to say that that's one of the initiatives going forward, I'll let you know how you can get involved in that. Another initiative that's happening right now is that the Illinois investor-owned utilities in your region are currently working on stretch code and BPS technical assistance. Slipstream and Mia have gone through phase 1, which was basically research and some savings estimation to give to the utilities. Oh, thank you. CJ was voted out of committee yesterday. Great to know. Aw, Mavis, you're my representative. That's so nice. I live in Aurora. Okay. Okay. Anyway, and you came to my house and you're super nice. Okay. Anyway, phase 2 is what we're working on now, which is more the actual policy adoption and program development. So what we are doing is we're working with different municipalities in these utility regions to understand what kind of technical assistance they want, to see if we can help them get involved in any of the adoption processes to move policies forward, specifically stretch codes and BPS. And then the utilities are interested in what kind of technical assistance you want. So if you want programs that can help move these policies along or help comply with the policies, that we want to know. So let you know how you can get involved with this as well. And then, Jeanette, do you want to talk a little bit about the municipal energy planning that's happening?
Sure. I'll keep it pretty brief right here, but this is work that we're doing with ComEd specifically, and thinking about kind of that question of Allison posed, like, who doesn't need help, right? So, but this is basically this is saying, you know, this is looking at a little bit broader than building energy codes, but looking at municipal operations and community-wide energy goals. And the pilot here is it's not in place yet. We're kind of researching the possibility of this, is that utility would support municipals in implementation and strategic planning around their energy goals, either create those energy goals or meet those energy goals. So it's looking at everything from, you know, energy efficiency in the municipal level to the community-wide level, really looking at it holistically and seeing where municipalities can utilities can support municipal energy goals. And I should mention this here, that research is in progress right now. It would be great if anybody wants to talk a little bit more from the group that's here, follow up with me later. I am interested in hearing some feedback on this potential program. So I'll leave it at that.
Great. Thank you, Jeanette. So I'm just going to move on to our next thing because we have 9 minutes left and I want to open this to discussion and talk specifically about how you can get involved. But first, let's figure out exactly, which of these you're most interested in. So we have a poll. So what do you need in order to move forward with these policies? We would just suggest selecting the top 3 that are most relevant to you. And this will just help us kind of prioritize going forward, but obviously none of these are off the table. And we're just trying to get a feel for what do you need help with? What would be most helpful to you? And Edith, I saw your question, and so the Energy Codes Advisory Council is actually mandated by statute. So they have specific people that are already that need to be on it. I'm not sure how municipalities can get involved beyond working with the state of Illinois. I think they already have a municipal representative, but I would say even if you're not technically a representative, the process is 100% open to the public, and they've already been doing it remotely and via like Zoom for many years. And so anyone can participate in that process. Okay, so we have about 50% have voted and taken this poll. And so we're looking at funding and incentives look like they've come up to the top here, and policy framework or guide, great, because we have lots of those resources. And then technical support training look like they've come up there too. So this is really, really helpful information for us. Okay, I'm going to just go into next steps, and this is just really specific. So participation, so this is for new buildings. If you want to participate in the baseline energy code adoption process, that's one thing. Make energy code compliance a priority. We can help you with that too. Make a commitment to the stretch energy codes. And there's some different options here. I'll go over that in a second. But basically, if CEJA passes, commit to adopting the stretch code that comes out of that process. If it does not happen via CEJA, then commit to adding amendments to your local commercial energy code, and then working with the utilities on that would be helpful. And then one of the things that you can also consider is New Buildings Institute's Building Decarbonization Code, which Diana put into the comments or into the chat, so you can see a link to that. And I wish I had more time to go over all of this because it's really interesting. But you guys do have that information in the presentation, which I hope you have. And if we have time and you want to, maybe we can go back to that. But I just want to get for existing buildings, you can set energy goals. You can participate in this utility outreach program. You can participate in this energy planning program. You can track your building energy use. There's a couple of different options here. You can improve your building performance. And so one of the ways you can do this is working with the CEJA building performance standard. If that does end up completely passing, you can look at the framework that Diana kind of laid out on building performance standards. If you want to adopt your own building performance standard, obviously we would suggest that you do some of the other things like benchmarking ordinances first, but that's just something that you can consider as a long-term goal. And then if you want any other kind of policy compliance, you can work with Slipstream or NBI or MIA on this. And we are always available, and you guys can work through Edith on that if you like. I really do like that idea of, you guys already kind of have it with your compact, but something that's regionally developed, because it helps to really pool your resources here. So, again, here's another poll. If you would like to receive more information, you can put your email in the chat with which municipality that you're representing. We will be working with Edith directly on some of this, but if you feel like you want to contact us directly, you can put your email in the chat as well. So that being said, I know we only have 5 minutes left now, technically. I guess I would like to know, we're here to help. We want to get people involved in this. I don't want to take away from the stuff that I pulled off from Diana, and Diana, I'm really sorry that we had to do that. So I guess, is there anything that's missing or that people want to talk about? Feel free to put anything in the chat. Edith, do you have anything that you want to wrap up with in terms of next steps? Because for me, the next step is working with Edith on some of these utility initiatives that we've been talking about for stretch codes and BPS and the utility planning. But I want to make sure that that's where you are, and how do you want to do that?
So I put that in the chat. We would like to work together and just share opportunities that you have, that we can invite communities to participate. There was a lot of great actions there at the end, and if we could parse them out and then say when there's an opportunity to participate, we can send that out and try to help just inform and encourage participation. But just a minute or two left, a couple of minutes, I'd like to hear from anybody on the committee with questions or feedback.
Yeah,
the polls were very helpful, by the way.
Yeah, please chime in, folks, if you have any comments or quick questions that either Allison, Diana, Edith, and if they're for me, I'll be happy to deflect. I think the building code stuff is just absolutely fascinating. And I think this is one area where a lot of municipalities, irrespective of size, and if I may say respectfully, irrespective of sophistication, can address this. It's I think fairly straightforward and simple, and most people understand that efficiency in the front end means savings in the long end. So
right. So I'm not hearing any, I would like to, I'm just going to go back to Diana's slides if you don't mind, because she has some really great info on, oh my gosh, did I just draw on? Okay, sorry. I don't know if you all can see that. Okay, I don't know if I did that. On this decarbonization code. And I think that that's just a really interesting way we can wrap it up. Diana, does that work for you to do this?
Yeah, that would be great. So I put it in the chat, but NBI just released in February what we are calling a building decarbonization code. And they're basically amendments to the 2021 ICC based on the 5 foundations I discussed at the beginning of our time together. So the code itself, the decarbonization code addresses key areas for electrification, heating, water heating, cooking, and lighting. And for buildings that want to install combustion equipment, we would require electric readiness in those buildings, which were changes that were suggested to the 2021 ICC. And I believe municipalities voted for those changes, but then they were dropped at the last minute. So are currently not in the 2021 ICC. The Building Decarbonization Code also includes suggested amendments for on-site renewable energy, storage readiness, requirements for EV charging, that was a question in the chat, and demand response requirements. So literally when municipalities, if you are involved in the Capital Development Board, when they're considering changes to the 2021 ICC, you can take this Building Decarbonization Code and tell them to add these amendments for Illinois. Or if you're developing your own stretch code, if CEJA does not get passed, you can add those changes to your own municipalities to require EV charging stations in all new multifamily buildings, for example. So I'll leave it at that. I know we're at 12:30.
Great. Thanks, Diana. Go ahead, Mayor Burns or Edith. Thank you for having us.
Diana,
Thank you so
very
much.
Allison, thank you very much. Great information. Edith, if there's anything else you want to touch on before we bid farewell and remind everyone that our next meeting is tentatively scheduled for April the 20th?
Correct. I just would like to a couple of more reminders. And last meeting we talked about, we did a roundtable and learned about opportunities for virtual Earth Day engagement. Just want to say that Cheryl and Cynthia have done a great job and assembled that toolkit. It just got mailed out yesterday or Monday. So we can send that link around again. So we did what you asked us to. It's good to go. Have a great Earth Day. And if you haven't adopted the GRC, please join us. I'm trying for 140 communities by Earth Day. So
we're at what number now?
We're at 133. So we do have a ways to go.
Oh, that's nothing, for God's sake.
We can make it happen. Last year was a little rough, but we can make it happen. I also am incredibly grateful to Diana and Allison and Mayor Burns for bringing this information to us. It feels like we have a lot of work to do, and I think I'm just really pleased that everyone's interested in this. And we'll share information with Diana and Allison as far as who's interested, and see if we can't be in communication as opportunities emerge. I will say for the caucus, we'll probably look at some kind of grant and collaboration to better determine what's the right actions for us. And then some of those things like policy framework or guide, it seems like that should be ultimately fundable, and that we'd like to help out with that.
Fantastic. Again, thank you, Diana. Thank you, Allison, and thank you, everyone. For all of you, I know you will echo my sentiments to our colleague, Cynthia. We wish her the very best and much success at the Citizens Utility Board. Thank you for all your work with the GRC. Happy birthday to the GRC. Enjoy your Tuesday, celebrate safely St. Paddy's Day, and we will see you in about a month. Thanks, everyone.
Great. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, everybody. Bye-bye.